his policies from an economic point of view are a complete disaster. I mean, to think that you can heal a country with import duties, with tariffs, is a ludicrous idea. And a tariff or an import duty, we have to be very clear about this, is a tax. Someone has to pay this tax. But it is not clear when you imposed this tax, when you introduced the tariffs, who will pay it? That remains to be seen, and no economist can tell you precisely, because it depends very much on the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply at that particular time. But in general, the tax will be shared somewhat. Say, if America introduces taxes on China, it is likely that part of the tax will be paid by the American consumer because they buy consumer goods from China. And part of the tax may be paid by the importer or the exporter, and part of the tax by the laborer in China. But exactly, is it 90% that is being paid by the consumer in America or 90% by the manufacturers in China? That is not clear. And Trump doesn't know it. And the problem with these tariffs is also the following. You see, modern manufacturing is very complex. Something that you buy, say an iPhone or whatever, is manufactured in many different countries, and the parts are then shipped into an assembly plant, and the assembly plant puts it together and sells it to a distributor in America or a shop or whatever, or the consumer directly. Now, the fact that these parts come from different countries makes it very difficult. Say, you have to then exempt the parts that say come to America, because if the parts are taxed at the same rate as the final product, nobody will ship it to America anymore. There will not be an advantage to shift production to the US, and so forth and so on. So there are lots of things that you don't know. But Trump, he has a brain like a 12 years old playing in a sandbox, bullying other people around and thinking that he knows, but he doesn't know. That's the problem. It's like most politicians are interventionists when they should step back and say, let the market regulate these things. And in my opinion, the tariffs, and you will see the impact on the US economy shortly, will result in shortages and huge price swings on both sides. And in my opinion, it will have a negative impact on the global economy. The fundamental problem of the US economy is that already before Keynes, but especially after John Maynard Keynes, the emphasis of the US policymakers has been consumption and the encouragement of consumption instead of the encouragement of savings and investments. And the US has a trade and current account deficit and a budget deficit, household deficit. And the cause of all these deficits is overspending, spending too much and saving too little. But that they will never analyze in this way. They will say, well, we have a trade deficit because other countries cheat. The nonsense. What is cheating? If people work in factories in China and they sweat producing goods and the US buys them at low cost, who makes a good deal? The US makes a good deal. They're exporting dollars that depreciate in value in the long run. Sadly, I have to say, in Europe, it's very difficult to see how the trend will reverse and move completely to the right. I think the socialist ideology is so ingrained and people are used to get subsidies from the government, subsidies in form of children allocation. For each family that has a child, they get some money from the government, and then each person who is unemployed, they get some money from the government. So this subsidizing people in just about every aspect of life makes it very difficult for someone to govern on the basis of reducing government expenditures. That is more or less out of the question. And you can only increase taxation up to a certain extent. Afterwards, people move out or they find ways not to pay taxes and so forth. So I think it will take a long time for the system to really change. And unfortunately, the system in Europe will probably change when the economy is really very deteriorates much more than it has already deteriorated. The problem is that the economy has deteriorated mostly for poor households and lower middle class and the middle class, but not for the super rich. The super rich, they actually did well in the last 12 months. Stock markets in Europe have gone up significantly, and even this year they've gone up. So the wealthy people are not suffering, and so they continue to vote and support the socialists, because the socialists are a form of government that encourages corruption and dealings that benefit certain interest groups. And so the wealthy people, instead of fighting the socialists, they embrace them because they know they can bribe them. And by bribing a socialist, say 100, they can make a profit of 10,000. That is the European system. In my opinion, it is another disaster because we have seen that government spending as a percentage of the economy, as it goes up, say in 1910, no European country had government spending of more than 12% of GDP. Now it's across the board approximately 50% plus minus. Some countries 60%. But as government spending increases, the states move into a condition of essentially bankruptcy. But the government can postpone bankruptcy because they control the money printing process. But the money printing process has disadvantages in the sense that the purchasing power of paper money diminishes. In other words, money becomes worth less and less, and we can measure that against, say, cryptocurrencies, or especially over longer periods of time. We can measure 1 unit of paper money. How much gold does it buy? How much silver does it buy? And when the quantity of paper money keeps on increasing in order to buy an ounce of gold, then the purchasing power of paper money declines. And that is an obvious sign. So over the last, say, 50, 60 years, paper money has depreciated significantly. Initially, it didn't happen in Germany and in most European countries, but lately, say in the last 30 years, even in Germany, the paper money has lost its purchasing power. And Germany is making a huge mistake by increasing government spending. They should cut government spending, kick out all the Greens and socialists out of the government, and go back to an economy where people work, and if they don't work, they don't get any subsidies. I think the dollar is a doomed currency, but right now, as a unit of trade, of commerce, the dollar is still the most accepted currency. I mean, I have money in different currencies and different countries and so forth, but the dollar is still my most important asset, which then leads to another issue that I'd like to discuss very briefly, because it's interesting. Say I have portfolios that are valued in dollars, okay? And I have portfolios that are also valued in euros or in Swiss francs. Now, when the dollar weakens, in other words, other countries' currencies appreciate, my dollar valuation portfolios tend to appreciate because the component that is not in dollars goes up relative to my dollar holdings. So it's favorable. A weak dollar for my dollar valuation is favorable for that portfolio. But the portfolio in Swiss franc tends to appreciate when the dollar goes up because the dollar holdings, say 50% of the portfolio, is then translated into more Swiss francs. Whereas if the dollar weakens considerably, everything else being equal, the Swiss franc valued portfolio will go down in value. It's been quiet around the BRICS. This is to some extent true, but some stocks in the BRICS and in emerging markets have done very well. So in the stock markets, actually, there have been some interesting moves. And I'd say in every discussion about investments, people always ask me about the stock market. The stock market nowadays is complex because on the one hand, you have the US, which is expensive by valuation measures. And on the other hand, you have Europe that is relatively inexpensive and emerging economies that is very cheap relative to the US, including China. Now, what could happen is that money, which is now allocated something like 60% to the US, flows out of the US and flows into Europe and emerging markets, and that these markets subsequently outperform the US, as they have actually over the last 6 to 9 months. So the European market, say you look at today, year to date, the US market, despite its recent recovery, is still down, but European markets are up strongly, especially measured in US dollars. Because in US dollars, you have the appreciation of stocks and the appreciation of the currency, which is roughly 5% in the last 3 months. This is a question I'm always asking myself. Does gold tell us that we are in the midst of a huge monetary depreciation phase and that, people will want to have something that is like an anchor or something safe? The question also relates, is gold here expensive or is it inexpensive? Say I'm a man or other wealthy people, they have, say, 100 million or 10 million or whatever. And then they own the bulk of their assets in real estate, in equity stocks, in their own businesses, in cash deposits, in art, and so forth and so on. How much of that, say 10 million or 100 million, should be in gold, if any at all? I think most people have practically nothing in gold. The young people, for them gold was too boring and they bought cryptocurrencies. The old people, like my age, my generation, a lot of them, they sold their gold already because they're also smart and they always talked about the correction already $1,000 ago. So the ownership of gold is very small among the public. We also see it at the outstanding shares of ETFs, gold ETFs. It's tiny. And in my view, if I look at gold just as how much do people own gold? I mean, in my view, the world is grossly underweight gold. Now, if I look at gold and I compare it to the price of wheat, corn, soybeans, sugar, then gold is expensive because I can buy with 1 ounce of gold a lot of sugar. I can buy with 1 ounce of gold a lot of bread. So in that sense, gold as a monetary asset is very cheap. As a trading asset, is quite expensive. Silver and platinum, I have to specify that, are cheap relative to gold, but they're not cheap relative to wheat and corn and soybeans and so forth. But it is true that today there's better value in silver, especially in platinum. I would accumulate platinum here.